Welcome to the Three Martini Lunch. Grab a stool next to Greg Columbus of Radio America and Jim Garrity of National Review. Three Martinis coming up.
Hey, really glad you're with us for the Monday edition of the Three Martini Lunch. Definite good, definite bad, definite crazy martinis for you today. So let's dive right in, and we're going to kind of have a Joe Biden sandwich with numbers here. The first one is a significant poll from NBC News, which is definitely not good for the sitting president, and yet that leads us to a curious, crazy martini. So stay tuned for that. So, Jim, the new NBC poll is out. It has, in a head-to-head, Donald Trump ahead of Joe Biden by 5 points. In addition to that, we've got right track, wrong track numbers, favorable, unfavorable, also head-to-head on specific key issues in the campaign. So right track, wrong track. And I honestly can't remember the last time the right track was even competitive in this. 73-22 Americans think we're on the wrong track. Biden underwater on his approval, 54-36, only 17% very positive, 43% very negative. Trump's underwater as well, 38 approve, 52% disapprove. He's got 22% who are very positive on him, 44% though very negative. Unless you think that, well, maybe they will go to Kamala Harris. No, she's underwater worse than all of them. 28% approval, 53% disapproval, only 10% with a very positive view of her, 42% highly negative, which is one of the reasons we're in this mess. Head-to-head, securing the border and controlling immigration. Trump leads Biden 57-22. Dealing with the economy, Trump 55-33. Dealing with crime, which Biden actually beat him on in this poll just before Election Day 2020. It's now Trump 50-29 over Biden. Being competent and efficient, Trump 48-32. Improving America's standing in the world. I guess they didn't poll this one last time, but it's now 47-36 in favor of Trump. Having the necessary mental and physical health to be president, 46-23 in favor of Trump. And they're almost dead even on the nebulous protecting democracy. In fact, the only things that Biden leads on by 12 points are on abortion and treating immigrants humanely and protecting immigrant rights, in which he leads by 17 points, 48-31. So, Jim, almost any way you look at this, and, you know, we talked about on Friday, the Democrats are going to be crowing about Bidenomics after the last jobs report, potentially. And if Republicans don't go with the immigration bill, which we'll talk about in more detail in the next martini, they'll try to paint Republicans as the obstructionists there too. But it's obvious the American people have seen Joe Biden on all of these issues, and they're not pleased.
Well, first of all, Greg, you began by saying that today's podcast features a Joe Biden sandwich. Do you know what goes into a Joe Biden sandwich?
What?
A lot of ham, a lot of bologna, and corn pops.
Perfect.
Yeah, so I have a feeling that a lot of Monday editions of this podcast from now until November will have some weekend unveiled on the Sunday shows that will show Joe Biden in trouble. And the reason that Democrats should be having an increasing gripping anxiety is that we've been in this cycle for at least the better part of a year. You know, the Democrats had a better than expected midterms. And they could kind of talk themselves into believing, oh, okay, Biden's more popular than we think, and Trump and the MAGA Republicans are less popular, and our side will show up to vote, and their side won't show up to vote, and we're going to be fine. Each month since then, you see this recurring. Biden's job approval rating and just ratings all across the board keep going down. And it's not that, oh, well, it's, you know, don't worry, good unemployment numbers are going to rectify this. Don't worry, good stock market numbers are going to rectify this. It's been very transparent. Americans think Joe Biden is too old to do the job, period. And there's really, short of going out there and doing cartwheels, I don't think there's much that Biden can do about this because he can't change his age. And I noticed, and I was talking about this with Hugh Hewitt this morning, that we have not seen Biden address from the Oval Office or anywhere else about the U.S. airstrikes against the Houthis. We have not seen any address from the White House or from Biden directly talking about the strikes against Iranian proxy targets in Iraq and Syria. Very traditionally, this is the sort of thing a president of the United States would do. They'd go to either behind the Oval Office or somewhere else in the White House. They'd say, my fellow Americans, we have today, this is something a president usually does, and Biden has not done this. And I don't subscribe to the idea that this is some sort of deliberate messaging strategy, that if Biden doesn't talk about deaths of American servicemen and issues like that Americans won't notice. Americans are going to notice. This is not the sort of thing you can just, hope to go away quickly in a news cycle. Biden's not out there because I think he can't. All right? Biden is not doing the traditional Super Bowl Sunday interview. Right? I don't, do you think that's a deliberate messaging strategy? Do you think it's that the White House is just terrified of having Joe Biden go out there and talk without any handler, without any teleprompter to read from? And Americans can see this. So, the entire Democratic strategy for 2024 basically counts on Trump's unpopularity and outside factors. Maybe the economy will be doing really, really well. And that will be enough to hide the fact that the president turns 82 shortly after Election Day. And that's a giant gamble. I can't guarantee one way or the other how it will shake out. We're talking about some very big forces in American politics. But man, this entire process is, whistling past the graveyard of hoping that Americans can somehow be fooled into not thinking about Joe Biden's age just long enough for them to make their decision in the 2024 election.
Yeah, I mean, they're basically relying on guilty verdicts and making people believe that this will be the last election that's ever held if Donald Trump is elected this time, which if you're the incumbent, you really should have a better record to run on than that if you want to have a good chance to win. And we talked about the jobs report, but it's kind of baked in the cake because you still have the inflation situation. We'll see what the numbers are in subsequent jobs reports, but we're kind of at the point now where people already know what they think. And unless there's a major consistent trend in a different direction, I don't think you're necessarily going to get a lot of people deciding really late in the game, you know what, after all, the economy, despite the fact that I'm paying way more for everything else, it really is doing better because I looked at the latest jobs report. Because as you mentioned last time, Jim, people are focusing on whether or not they can afford stuff as opposed to whether they're going to get a job right now, which is a little bit different than we have been in some previous election cycles. And the same thing with the border. I don't think people are going to, if they were really, really concerned about it, and they should be, and they think that Joe Biden's done a lousy job, they're not necessarily going to jump on all of a sudden because he supports a specific piece of legislation and go, oh, yep, he's the right guy on this after all. You've got 3 years of people seeing what you are and are not doing on stuff. And at that point, it's going to take a lot to get people to change their mind on what they think about the job you've done.
Greg, I think the administration's messaging between now and November will be echoing that of a Vox headline from November. Quote, "The problem isn't inflation, it's prices."
Does that mean it's the retailer's fault that everybody's just artificially keeping their prices high and it's not the economic conditions?
It's evil, sinister forces, corporations. Buy Vox stock.
Thanks for that, Vox, as always, leading us to the real facts of the story here. But all right, well, while you're trying to figure out what the scrambling Democratic strategy is going to be here, let's talk about the great deals that you can find at 4Patriots. Fantastic products, good deals, and you can find them at 4patriots.com/martini. Right now, they've got new offers going on. You've heard so much about the Patriot Power Generator 2000X. Right now, you can get a free solar panel with the purchase of the generator. And also, as always, free shipping on orders over $97. The new solar generator is worth its weight in gold because it has double the capacity and is expandable so that you can run the big appliances like your fridge even longer if the power is out for quite a while. It also has 12 outlets, including 4 AC to power more devices at once. Visit 4patriots.com/martini to get your Patriot Power Generator 2000X with a free solar panel included. Plus, get free shipping on orders over $97. Save more and get peace of mind now by going to the number 4patriots.com/martini. That's 4patriots.com/martini. All right, Jim, on to our bad martini now. And if you ever really proud of your legislation and you want to make sure that it gets the biggest splash possible, release it on Sunday night. But no, a lot of criticism about the fact that we hadn't seen the details of this bill, but it's finally out now, negotiated by Schumer and Lankford and Chris Murphy of Connecticut, which automatically ought to raise a few red flags. But it was a few weeks ago, Jim, that we saw reports of what was in this bill and was extremely concerning, including the fact that the border would automatically close only after 7 consecutive days of 5,000 illegal crossings per day. Well, we were told by Lankford that wasn't in the bill. Turns out it is in the bill. We were also very concerned about people getting initial approval for an asylum hearing, which could take years, although they say in the bill now that this would be fast-tracked much more than it currently is. But you automatically get work permits until your situation is dealt with. And let's be honest, how much do we trust the government to expedite this? A lot. And so there are some tougher asylum processes here in terms of what it takes to get to stay once you get to your hearing. But there's a lot in this bill, Jim, if you look at over and over and over. It's all at the discretion of the secretary. And since we know who the secretary is, and he might be impeached within hours here, or at least sometime this week, leaving it up to him doesn't instill me with much confidence at all. So you already have folks like Steve Scalise, the majority leader, the speaker, Mike Johnson, saying this is not even going to get a vote in the House. It's dead on arrival. Over on the Senate side, of course, you got the Democrats saying that if you're serious about improving things at the border, you're going to pass the bill in short order. And Mitch McConnell's statement didn't quite say we need to pass it, but it's pretty clear he's leaning heavily in that direction. So what do you make of the fact that the actual bill looks way too close to what we feared it did?
Yeah, look, I think Lankford's going to get an enormous amount of grief for this, and it's unfortunate, but I think he's got it coming. According to my conversation with Hugh Hewitt earlier this morning, it authorizes, but does not appropriate, a couple of $100 million for border fencing over a 5-year period. A very, like, it's one of those things where if you could say it was half a loaf, and you could say they got us closer to having the border fencing that folks on the right generally wanted to see, you could at least begin making the argument for this. But this is 5% of a loaf, 10% of a loaf. It's a very small percentage of what they really wanted to see. Major concessions. You can already see there's a provision in there for engagement with a U.S. citizen gives you an exemption. Boy, that wouldn't get abused. And then you can throw in the fact that they want to put ankle bracelets on people. And as we all know, there's no way to get an ankle bracelet off you, right? You know, it just looks like a really bad bill. And I think one of the things that jumps out, like we've been hearing these leaks and a very negative reaction from Speaker Mike Johnson and other key House Republicans. And I don't want to say, well, once you hear that, you should scrap it and start over again. But I almost felt like all of this was going through the motions, that I feel like this is the third or fourth time we've talked about the death of this bill. And it's just been, it's still dead. It's very much it's like the Monty Python parrot sketch. This is an X legislation. This is, because it's nowhere near what the House wants. And you could argue whether, their expectations are realistic or something. Look, you knew that it was going to have a significant chunk of border funding. It was going to have a lot more for enforcement, and it was not going to this 5,000 people per day limit. It just, the signals for have been there for weeks that this was not good. This was operating in envisioning a much more friendly House of Representatives than one that currently exists. And so I imagine this will die a quick death. I do glad that they have this proposal for getting funding for Israel through separately. I think we probably need the same thing for Taiwan and for Ukraine. It's just way too little, too many concessions for too much of an improvement, and kind of surprised that Lankford could so misjudge the House Republican caucus so strongly and come back with a deal that he had to know there was no way this was going to get through. But I guess we have to continue the kabuki theater.
Conservatives on this have been burned so many times before, most especially through the Reagan amnesty in 1986. It was amnesty for, at that time, 3 million illegals in the country in exchange for much, much tougher border security. Well, one of them happened and one of them didn't. And as a result of that, we've heard a lot of lip service ever since. Clinton talked about it. Harry Reid even talked about it in the 90s. George W. Bush talked about it some, but then he kind of let it slip. He was more on the Chamber of Commerce side of this debate than the border security side. And then ever since then, I don't think anybody's really trusted Republicans to actually navigate this to the finish line. And that's why you're hearing so many people say, enforce the existing laws, and then we'll see if there's any tweaking that needs to be done down the line. This whole thing by Biden that he needs this legislation to take tougher action is ridiculous, because think about how much condemnation there was of Trump for taking decisive executive action and condemnation of Biden for reversing so much of what Trump did on the border. The executives have a lot of discretion on this, so him pretending that he doesn't have it now is pretty maddening. All right, Jim, this is going to seem almost a little bit paradoxical in light of our first martini today, because our first martini was Joe Biden's getting creamed in all of these issue matchups against Donald Trump, or at least a lot of them. Even head-to-head, he is losing by 5 points. And we've seen polls over time, I don't know that it was part of this NBC poll, of a lot of Democrats saying, you know what, it's probably time for somebody else, actually. But when they have the chance to vote for somebody else, they don't do it, at least not yet. Saturday was the first in the nation primary for Democrats, South Carolina. And yeah, it's Joe Biden against Marianne Williamson and Dean Phillips. So not exactly the crowded slate that it was 4 years ago. But in the Palmetto State, it was Joe Biden with 96.2% of the vote, to Marianne Williamson, surprisingly, coming in second with 2.1, with just over 2,700 votes. Not 27,000, 2,700. And then Dean Phillips with 1.7%, coming in with more than 2,200 votes. So if you look at where things were in 2020, there were 539,000 and some votes in that more competitive primary. This time, Biden had 126,000. So you add the other two, you're basically looking at roughly 130,000. So it's not competitive. And so most people there probably thought, what's the point? But if you're a Democrat and you're really worried about Joe Biden, you think you might want to explore one of these options a little bit more. Not that Biden wouldn't have won and wouldn't have won decisively, but for the two of the challengers to get less than 4% was quite something. Because, I mean, let's not pretend that Pat Buchanan was expected to do much against George H.W. Bush when Republicans were kind of frustrated after the tax hikes. And he ended up not winning, but causing a lot of frustration for the Bush campaign and doing pretty well in New Hampshire. And so maybe these are just really weak alternatives, but the Democrats in South Carolina, at least, seemed very uninterested in pursuing a different Democratic candidate.
So, Greg, I don't like picking on Dean Phillips, but I'll point out you're really having a rough day when you cannot keep your opponent's percentage of the vote outside of the range of normal human body temperature. 96.6. Usually we're 98.6, but so I understand most people actually run a little cooler than that. 96.6, the doctor's not worried yet. In fact, I believe that might well be the body temperature of Joe Biden. Old people get a little chilly. So here's the thing, and this echoes a conversation among some of my colleagues in the corner that, there's a great deal of Democratic nervousness about Joe Biden. There are all these rumors, people say, they're getting last second at the convention, they're going to substitute in Michelle Obama and all that stuff. I find that a little tough to believe. And one of the things that's kind of fascinating about this, and I'm glad you used the Pat Buchanan against George H.W. Bush example from 1992. A couple of weeks ago on Twitter, I'd made a reference to primary challenges, and I said that they're not that rare. And what it means is that they've been rare in the last few cycles. But going back to Reagan versus Gerald Ford, to Ted Kennedy against Jimmy Carter, it's not that unusual to see a primary challenge against an incumbent based on, at least certain cycles. And so we wouldn't expect Dean Phillips necessarily to overtake Joe Biden. But on the other hand, Dean Phillips, if you look at his congressional record since Biden took office, Dean Phillips has not voted against Biden's agenda anywhere on a single piece of legislation, a 100% support. So Dean Phillips is the same agenda, the same worldview, the same perspective on the issues, but in a younger, healthier 55-year-old body. So you'd think that'd be what Democrats would want. And as we see here, got nowhere. By the way, for those wondering about New Hampshire, so New Hampshire Democrats held their primary, but it didn't count for anything. No delegates will be awarded in that. And that's where Phillips did a fairly decent 20%. Also remember, Joe Biden's name was not on the ballot because he was effectively protesting. What he saw was I don't say illegal, but a primary that was occurring against the Democratic National Committee's rules. So now that it actually counts, Dean Phillips is struggling to hit 2%. I wonder if parties have learned the lesson from 92 and from 1980 and from 1976 a little too well. This idea that, you can't have any primary challenges to an incumbent president. That if you do it, you doom the guy to losing in the general election. It distracts him. It uses up resources. And so nobody wants to support any primary challenger, even though, because as we alluded to in this first martini, we have an almost 82, a guy who's going to be 82 right after Election Day, who's looking really weak head to head. Maybe this is when you need a primary challenge. Maybe this is when you should have had. It's entirely possible a lot of Democrats are going to say to themselves, Biden should not have run for another term. And, Nikki Haley's running around the country saying, look, one way or another, you get a woman president. You either get me or you get Kamala Harris as the president of the United States at some point in the next 4 years. So there is something kind of curious about this. And I think the Democrats, it is, I people say, oh, there's very low turnout in that South Carolina Democratic primary. Yeah, but Dean Phillips' job is to get people to turn out. Like that this is what you're trying to do here. It's not just to do the interviews. It's not just to, sign autographs. Your goal is to get people to come out and vote for you. And look, we always knew this was going to be South Carolina was one of Biden's best states in 2020. There's a little reason to think it was going to change. This is, but still 96.6 to 1.6. I don't even know what the point spread is, but I don't know if it was 95 percentage points, Greg.
Well, I mean, 2,239 votes. I grew up in a town of less than 10,000 people, and we had city council races where people got almost that many, to a couple hundred less than that. So this is a statewide race. Now, it was less than 5% turnout for the Democratic primary. And so it's just interesting how much intense interest in breaking down the numbers there was on Saturday night. I mean, I don't remember in 2020 people going, oh, Trump really took care of Joe Walsh and William Weld tonight. I mean, at a certain point, if you really don't have any serious competition, you don't need to have the breathless coverage. But if you're really worried about the status of your nominee, because there wasn't that with the Republicans in terms of the general base support for Donald Trump in 2020, you'd think somebody would get a little bit of momentum here. But it's crazy just how nobody showed up in general, and they certainly didn't show up to register a protest. Let me just mention real quick the Michelle Obama theory. I'm sure you're already aware of this, Jim, but the reason that keeps percolating out there is that there's this speculation that eventually the Democrats will realize that Biden's too much of a risk of losing to Trump, and the Democratic leadership can't handle that. And so the next obvious choice would be Kamala Harris, but as we just demonstrated in the polling, her numbers are actually worse than Joe Biden, so she doesn't necessarily provide a better option for the Democrats going head-to-head, although I haven't seen that specifically pulled out. But if you're going to bounce Kamala Harris, due to the intersectionality issues in the Democratic Party, you got to have a black woman, and well, that's where Michelle Obama comes in. I think that's where that persistent rumor comes from, because if you're not going to have Joe and you think Kamala's too big of a risk, those are the factors you got to have in place, and that's why she keeps popping up in conversation.
I think that's a big chunk of it, Greg, and I'm just going to add one point, which is that the average Democrat probably feels pretty good about Barack Obama. You might see in some progressive circles a sense that Obama's presidency was a failure, that he was too conciliatory, that he wasn't liberal enough. I know I can hear our right of center listeners, choking on whatever they're drinking as they hear that. But like that, you can find that viewpoint in certain Democratic circles. My guess is the average Democrat who voted for Obama twice is happy they voted that way and has fond memories of that. And I feel like when Biden was running in the 2020 cycle, his strongest sales pitch is like, look, you can't get a third term of Obama, but I'm the next best thing. Remember me? I was the wacky neighbor of the Obama administration. I was Barack's best buddy and all that. And kind of this attitude, this sense of that Biden was going to say, hey, you know what? I'm Obama's third term. Well, I think it's safe to say he's not. I think it's safe to say that most Democrats find him disappointing. And it's not just that Biden isn't as charismatic and isn't the first African-American president. All that. I think they just find him an across-the-board disappointment. And so I think why did we settle for the Veep? Isn't there anybody with the last name Obama who can run? And I think that's what this yearning is to kind of a restoration, a genuine third term of Obama. It's not going to happen, and I don't think it's very likely to happen, but I do think that's kind of this like fantasy wish casting amongst Democrats that they could go back to the good old days of, hope and change. And, when everyone was chanting Obama and Oprah was saying he was the one from the Matrix and all that stuff.
Yes, it's going to be Biden and Trump, most likely. So even though their negatives are sky high, that's where we're headed. Jim Garrity, National Review. I'm Greg Corombos of Radio America. Thanks so much for being with us today. Please subscribe to the 3 Martini Lunch if you don't already, and tell your friends about us as well. We'd love to have them listening. Thanks also for your 5-star ratings and your kind reviews. Please keep those coming. Get us on your home devices. All you have to say is play 3 Martini Lunch podcast. Follow us both on X. He's at Jim Garrity. I'm at Dateline_DC. Have a terrific Monday and join us again on Tuesday for the next 3 Martini Lunch.